The letter hit the floor of Calvin Hunter's ranch house like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through Gertrude Archer's chest nearly knocked her from her feet. "You think I need your charity," she said, and her voice came out razor-edged, the kind of sharpness a woman builds over years of swallowing pain until the edges calcify into something impenetrable. "You think I came all the way out to Colton Creek, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1883, to be handed a deed to land I didn't earn myself." Calvin Hunter stood on the other side of the kitchen table, his hat already in his hands, his jaw set in that infuriating way of his that said he would not argue, would not beg, would not raise his voice to match hers even as she was practically daring him to. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered from a decade of driving cattle across the Texas panhandle, and the look on his face was not anger. It was something far worse for Gertrude to contend with. It was patience. That patience cracked something open in her she had spent 4 years sealing shut. "I wrote it to you fair and legal," he said quietly. "The North Quarter, 40 acres. Water rights attached to the Bramble Creek tributary. It's yours." "Why?" she demanded, and the word came out cracked, betraying her more than she wanted. "Because you worked for it," he said simply. "Because you came here when you had no reason to trust anyone, and you stayed when you had every reason to leave, and because—" "Stop." She held up her hand. The trembling in her fingers was a secret she'd been keeping from herself as much as from him. "Stop saying kind things to me, Calvin." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said, and then he said nothing else at all. He set his hat on the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the cattle in the far pasture, the late afternoon sun gilding everything a deep amber gold, and he was absolutely quiet. And in that silence, Gertrude Archer felt every wall she had ever built begin, without ceremony, without warning, to tremble. That was where they were now. That was the moment. And to understand why it mattered so profoundly, why a deed of land and a quiet man's silence could break through what 4 years of spoken kindness never could, you had to go back to the spring of 1883, to a train platform in Abilene, Kansas, and to the woman Gertrude Archer had been before Calvin Hunter taught her, word by unspoken word, that some things were only true when they didn't need to be said. She had been 26 years old in April of that year, and she had been running. Not the breathless, panicked running of someone fleeing danger in the dark, but the cold, deliberate running of a woman who has made a calculation and decided that anywhere was better than here. Her here was a boarding house in Abilene run by a woman named Mrs. Calloway, where Gertrude had spent 3 years working as a seamstress and laundress after the death of her mother, and before that, 2 years in St. Louis trying to make something of herself in a city that had made it very clear it had no particular interest in the efforts of a woman without connections. Her father had died when she was 17, leaving her a small debt and a large silence. Her mother had followed at 23, leaving her an even larger silence and a very specific kind of grief that had no edges, only depth. In those years, men had tried to court her. Kind men, some of them with soft eyes and careful manners, who had said gentle things about her dark hair and her capable hands and her sharp mind. A lawyer's clerk in St. Louis had once spent 45 minutes telling her he admired her resilience. A bank teller in Abilene had written her a letter comparing her eyes to the sky over the Kansas plain, which was, she had thought at the time, less romantic than he imagined, since the sky over Kansas was frequently gray and threatening. She had turned them all away, not because she was cold, though people said she was, not because she didn't want to be loved, though she had told herself that particular lie with great dedication for several years, but because every kind word that had ever been aimed at her had been a precursor to something else. Her father's sweet apologies before he lost another month's wages at cards. Her mother's tender reassurances that everything would be fine, right up until the morning she was not. The lawyer's clerk in St. Louis had admired her resilience right up until he needed to borrow money he never repaid. The bank teller's poetic letter had been followed, 3 weeks later, by a very unpoetic request that she consider the economic advantages of marrying him, as if she were livestock he had already appraised. Gertrude Archer had therefore constructed a very effective system. She turned away kindness before it could become obligation. She turned away softness before it could become a trap. She kept herself efficient and capable and professional and thoroughly defended, and it had worked perfectly, and it had also made her quietly, privately, and in the deepest hours of the night, profoundly lonely. Which was why, on the morning of April the 14th, 1883, she was standing on the train platform in Abilene reading an advertisement from the Colton Creek Cattlemen's Association, which was seeking experienced workers for a large cattle operation in the Texas Panhandle. Room, board, and wages offered. No prior cattle experience required. Skills in sewing, cooking, or general ranch management welcome. Gertrude was very good at sewing. She was tolerable at cooking. And she had managed her own affairs for 9 years with a precision that she suspected was better than most, so general ranch management seemed like something she could learn. She wrote back the same afternoon. She received a reply 3 weeks later from a man named Calvin Hunter, who described himself as the owner and primary operator of Hunter's Cross Ranch, outside the town of Colton Creek, Texas, which was 2 days' ride south of Amarillo. He needed a housekeeper and general manager for the domestic operations of a ranch that employed 12 full-time hands and ran approximately 3,000 head of longhorn cattle across 40,000 acres of panhandle grassland. The wages were better than she had expected. The tone of the letter was businesslike and entirely without flourish, which she appreciated. He said nothing complimentary about her qualifications or her courage or any other aspect of her character, because he knew nothing about her character and had no basis for such an assessment, and the absence of hollow reassurance made her trust the letter more than any of the letters she had ever received. She sent a reply accepting the terms. She packed everything she owned into a single trunk and 2 bags. She arrived in Colton Creek on a dusty, brilliant Thursday in late May after a 2-day journey on the Texas and Pacific Railway, and she stepped off that train into a heat so immediate and specific that it felt personal, like the land was introducing itself through her skin. Calvin Hunter was waiting at the platform. She knew him immediately, not because she had any description of him, but because he was the only man standing still in a place where everyone else was moving. He was tall, dark-haired, and had the kind of face that had been shaped by weather into something honest. Not conventionally handsome in the way that men in magazines were handsome, but the kind of face you found yourself looking at again after you'd looked away, as though it had more in it than you'd initially catalogued. He held out his hand and said, "Miss Archer, Calvin Hunter, good trip." "Adequate," she said, and shook his hand once firmly, and looked at him directly in the eyes in the way that she had found tended to unsettle men who weren't expecting it. He looked back without unsettling at all, assessed her once with the same efficiency with which he'd presumably assessed every other new arrival at his ranch, and said, "Wagons out front. I can take that trunk." "I can manage it," she said. "I know you can," he said, and picked it up anyway, and carried it to the wagon without making a speech about it. She climbed up beside him on the wagon bench, and they rode the 3 miles out of town to the ranch largely in silence, with him pointing out 2 landmarks she'd need to know for navigation and her asking 2 questions of practical necessity. And by the time they arrived at Hunter's Cross, she had already decided that she could work here. The ranch itself was larger than she'd imagined and more austere than she'd hoped. The main house was a 2-story frame structure that had been built with more function than grace, clean but unornamented, with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and a kitchen that was functional and enormous. The bunkhouse stood to the north, and beyond it the barn and the corrals, and beyond those the beginning of the range that rolled out toward the horizon in every direction with the kind of vastness that either comforted you or swallowed you, depending on what you brought to it. Gertrude brought practicality, a complete inventory of the pantry within her first 2 hours, and a list of organizational improvements to the kitchen that she presented to Calvin at supper that evening, with the same directness with which she did everything. He read the list carefully, nodded 3 times, said most of that makes sense, and told her to order what she needed from the general store in town and charge it to the ranch account. She had expected argument, or at minimum an interrogation of her reasoning. The absence of both left her momentarily off balance, which she covered by asking a practical question about the supply schedule, and they moved on, and that was the beginning. The 12 hands employed at Hunter's Cross were a varied group. There was Amos Tilford, who was 60 and had been working cattle since before the Civil War, and had the hands to prove it, cracked and brown as old leather. There was Pete Delgado, who was Mexican-born and spoke English with a precision that suggested he'd learned it from books rather than from casual conversation, and who was the most skilled horseman Gertrude had ever watched. There was a young man named Danny Hoyle, who was only 19 and had a habit of hanging around the kitchen door asking whether there was anything she needed help with, in a tone that suggested he was practicing optimism as a survival strategy. And there was Ben Marsh. Ben Marsh was 35, sandy-haired, with a smile that arrived before the rest of his face did, if you knew what she meant. He was one of the senior hands, had worked for Calvin for 4 years, and he was the kind of man who knew exactly how charming he was and had built an entire philosophy of life around deploying it strategically. He began paying Gertrude the kind of attention she had years of practice refusing, and he did it with such confident good humor that she found herself almost liking him despite herself, in the way you might like a well-trained circus act. "Miss Archer," he said one morning about 2 weeks after her arrival, leaning in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup he'd brought back himself, which was not the arrangement but was not harmful enough to forbid. "You are without any question the finest cook in the Texas Panhandle, and I include my grandmother in that assessment, God rest her." "Your coffee is cold," Gertrude said without looking up from the account she was reconciling. "Bring it back at the proper temperature if you want a second cup." He laughed, delighted, as though she'd said something charming. "You don't soften for anyone, do you, Miss Archer?" "I'm not employed to be soft," she said. "I'm employed to run a functional household." "The two things are not the same." He said something else, something warm and slightly teasing, and she turned away from it the way she turned away from all of it, not rudely but firmly, the way you might close a door that had no business being open. What she noticed was that Calvin Hunter never did this. He didn't compliment the food, though she cooked it well. He didn't comment on her appearance, though she was aware, in the clear-eyed way of a woman who had no particular vanity but also no particular blindness, that she was reasonably attractive. He didn't remark on her competence or her efficiency or any of the things that other people found it necessary to narrate at her. He came to her with information she needed, and he received information she had, and they solved problems together with a minimum of decorative language, and he always, this was what she noticed, this was the thing she catalogued and returned to, always assumed she could handle whatever information she was given. He never softened news or framed difficulties in a way that was designed to protect her feelings rather than present her with facts. When the summer drought came in June and July and forced a difficult calculation about which pastures to rotate and how to ration the water from Bramble Creek, he brought the maps and the figures to the kitchen table and spread them out and said, "I need a second set of eyes on this," and he meant it. She looked at the numbers and the maps for 20 minutes and identified an allocation pattern that could reduce daily water draw by a third without affecting the herd's health, by staggering the rotation differently. He looked at her solution for about 5 minutes, then looked up and said, "That works." That was all. But something happened in his eyes when he said it that was different from the performed admiration of men who said, "Remarkable," and I'd have never thought of that, with the slightly desperate energy of people trying to make you feel good. What happened in Calvin Hunter's eyes was something simpler and therefore more devastating. It was simple recognition. It was the look of a person who had assessed a thing clearly and found it exactly as good as he had hoped. Gertrude went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to, and she told herself it meant nothing, and she believed herself, because she was very good at that. She had also begun to learn things about Calvin Hunter that complicated her professional assessment of him. She learned from Amos Tilford, who was the source of most of the ranch's institutional memory, and had no particular interest in gossip, but a great deal of interest in accuracy, that Hunter's cross had been built from almost nothing. Calvin had come to the Texas Panhandle at 21 in the spring of 1873, with money he'd earned driving cattle up the Kishom Trail from San Antonio, and he'd bought 40 acres and a herd of 80 cows from a man who was leaving for California and didn't want the trouble of taking them. He'd spent 6 years building the herd through a combination of hard work, good judgment, and the kind of relentless patience that Amos noted with some admiration had been known to unnerve other men. He'd acquired more land as it became available. He'd hired carefully. He'd survived the terrible winter of 1876 that had killed cattle across the Panhandle by a combination of preparation, and Amos said with a slight pause that meant something, the fact that Calvin had spent the preceding autumn doing things that the other ranchers had thought were excessive precautions, and that turned out to be exactly the right precautions. He had never married. Amos mentioned this not as gossip but as context, in response to a question Gertrude had not asked. He mentioned it in the way that people mention things they think you should know, and Gertrude filed it away with the same neutral efficiency with which she filed all information and told herself it was simply data. There had been a woman, Amos also said, though he said this more carefully, with a pause before it. A woman in Amarillo, years back, when Calvin had been in his mid-20s. A woman who had eventually married a man with more money and less weather in his face, and Calvin had not said much about it then, and had never said anything about it since. Gertrude recognized the architecture of that silence, because she lived in similar architecture herself. In August, 3 months after her arrival, Ben Marsh did something that demonstrated clearly why Gertrude's instincts about charm were so well calibrated. She found him, on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd come to collect the week's receipts from the lockbox in the ranch office, going through the account ledger with the focused attention of a man reading something he wasn't supposed to. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and the smile was present before the explanation, which was its own kind of information. "Just checking whether the supply figures matched the delivery records," he said, smooth as river water. "That's my job," Gertrude said, "and that ledger isn't yours to open." "I was trying to help, you were not," she said, and the simplicity of it shut him down more completely than argument would have. She didn't accuse him of anything specific. She didn't make a speech about hidden motives or betrayal. She simply stated the fact of what she'd observed and waited. He left. She inventoried the ledger carefully and found nothing missing, but found that several of the monthly supply figures had been marked in pencil with small notations that suggested someone was tracking how much surplus there was at the end of each billing period. She brought this to Calvin. He looked at the ledger for a long time without speaking, and she watched the expression on his face, which did not change in any way that was visible, but in which she detected, with the precision of someone who had spent years reading faces for the information they tried to keep private, something that was not quite surprise. Something that was closer to the particular weariness of a suspicion being confirmed. "I'll talk to Marsh," he said. "Before you do," she said, "I'd recommend checking whether the figures correlate with the Amarillo supplier's delivery receipts. If they do, then someone may have been planning to document a discrepancy that doesn't exist, which would be a different kind of problem than simple theft." Calvin looked at her for a moment, and she saw that thing again in his eyes, that recognition. "I'll check," he said. He checked. The receipts matched. Ben Marsh was let go from Hunter's Cross at the end of August with the wages he was owed, and a conversation that Calvin conducted privately and never reported the contents of to anyone, which Gertrude thought was a kind of restraint that most men would not have managed. After Marsh left, Danny Hoyle knocked on the kitchen door one evening looking genuinely worried and said, "Miss Archer, I know it's not my place, but Marsh told some of the other hands before he left that you had it out for him, that you were jealous of the attention he was paying you and made up the ledger thing as revenge. I wanted you to know that nobody who actually knows you believes that." "Thank you, Danny," she said, and meant it, which surprised her slightly. "Mr. Hunter told us what actually happened," Danny continued. "Not all of it, but enough. He said Marsh was running a dishonest scheme and that you caught it, and that was the end of it." She held that information for a moment. "He said that to the hands." "Yes, ma'am, in the clear, no vagueness about it." She turned back to the dough she'd been working and said nothing else, and later that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, she thought about what it meant that a man had, without being asked, and without any apparent expectation of reward, stood up for her version of events in front of people whose respect he cared about. She had been waiting for the hidden motive, for the moment when that defense would be presented to her as a debt she owed, for the "I helped you, therefore." But September came and October, and he never produced it. He simply had done it because it was accurate and moved on, and the absence of the eventual demand was so disorienting that Gertrude spent several weeks checking for it the way you check for a sound you were sure you heard. It wasn't there. Fall in the Texas Panhandle arrived like a negotiation, the heat grudgingly conceding ground degree by degree, until October came in with a cold that had teeth and a sky that went a particular shade of blue that Gertrude found she was looking at more than was strictly necessary. The work at the ranch shifted with the season. The fall cattle drive was the centerpiece of the ranching year, a push of cattle to the shipping pens in Amarillo that took most of the hands and most of Calvin's attention for 3 weeks in October. He asked Gertrude if she would manage the ranch in his absence. Not the household, she already managed the household. The ranch. The accounts, the supply orders, the communication with the lawyers in Amarillo about the land lease renewals, the supervision of the hands left behind. She said yes because it was a logical extension of her competencies, and not because something about being asked, rather than being flattered or cajoled, made her feel seen in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. The drive went. The ranch quieted to its essential rhythms. Gertrude managed it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, and when a problem arose in the second week, a fence line on the south border had been cut, likely by the Hanson family who owned the adjacent property and had been pushing at Hunter's Cross's water access for 2 years. She dealt with it. She rode out herself with Amos Tilford and 2 of the younger hands, inspected the damage, assessed the situation, and then rode to the Hanson property and had a conversation with Everett Hanson that was precise, civil, and left no room for misinterpretation. The fence would be repaired. The water rights were documented in county records, and she had the relevant pages memorized. If this happened again, there would be a formal legal response that would be both expensive and inconvenient for everyone involved. Everett Hanson was a man in his 50s who had not expected this, and said so with his face, if not with his words. She rode home and documented the incident and the resolution and had it ready for Calvin when he returned. He read it carefully. He looked up. "You rode out yourself." "Amos came with me," she said. "I know, I'm asking if you rode out yourself." "Yes," she said. "The situation required a decision-maker, not a messenger. I made the decision." He held her eyes for a moment, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before, something that was not just recognition. Something that ran deeper than that, something that looked, she thought, if she were going to be honest with herself, a great deal like the beginning of a feeling she could not afford to name. "You handled it right," he said, and went back to the papers. November came. The work continued. The seasons moved in their particular panhandle way, with sudden cold fronts rolling in from the north and frost on the porch boards in the mornings, and the cattle moving with the particular slow dignity of animals that have decided whether is a minor inconvenience. Gertrude settled into the rhythms of the ranch, in a way she had not expected to settle into anything, in a way that felt, if she was careful about how she framed it, like something approaching belonging. She noticed that she had stopped waiting for the hidden motive. She noticed this the way you notice the absence of a pain you'd been carrying so long it had become part of your inventory. She also noticed, with the precision and alarm of someone who had promised herself this was a professional arrangement only, that she noticed things about Calvin Hunter with an attention that was not professional. The way he moved through the work of the ranch with a complete absence of performance. The way he spoke to the hands, clearly and without condescension, with the same respect he gave to Amos as he gave to Danny, in degrees calibrated to experience rather than to hierarchy. The way he handled difficulty without broadcasting it, the particular set of his shoulders that meant a problem was being carried, and the way he never made that problem someone else's burden to witness. The way he sometimes, in the evenings, sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and actually read, books, not newspapers, not just newspapers, in the thin lamplight that fell through the window, and she could see his profile from the kitchen, and she had begun, without consciously deciding to do this, to find small reasons to stay in the kitchen a little longer than necessary. She was appalled at herself. She had a system. The system worked. The system kept her from the particular dark past of loneliness by betrayal that had been the defining architecture of her adult life, kept her from the trap of needing someone who would use that need as leverage, kept her safe from the forced choice between love and dignity that she had watched her mother make and had promised herself she never would. She doubled down on the system. She was efficient and professional, and she turned away every approach, every warmth, every soft thing that was aimed at her. In December, a woman named Clara Whitfield arrived in Colton Creek. Clara Whitfield was 32, recently widowed, and the daughter of a ranching family from East Texas. She was the kind of woman who made rooms feel they had been improved by her entrance, dark-eyed and graceful, and with a manner that was warm without being calculated, the kind of warmth that was simply native to her rather than deployed. She had come to Colton Creek to stay with her cousin for the winter while she decided what to do with her late husband's small estate, and she began attending the Sunday services at the Methodist Church. And Calvin Hunter also attended the Sunday services at the Methodist Church, and Gertrude heard about their meeting from Danny, who was observant in the way that young people with no particular agenda are sometimes observant. She told herself she did not care about this. She told herself it was none of her business and was irrelevant to her professional function, and she told herself this very firmly on several consecutive mornings and evenings, and would have told herself in the nights too, except that the nights had taken to conducting their own version of the argument, where her certainty was considerably less effective. Clara Whitfield came to the ranch once in December with her cousin, a social call of the kind that were made occasionally in the ranching community, and Gertrude served coffee and was precisely and efficiently hospitable, and she watched Calvin talk to Clara with the particular attention of someone who is trying to read a document in a foreign language. He was polite. He asked questions. He listened. He was, with Clara Whitfield, the same man he was with everyone, and Gertrude could not for the life of her determine what she thought about that. After they left, Calvin came to the kitchen and poured himself another cup of coffee and said, "Mrs. Whitfield asked about the land situation on the Bramble Creek tributary. I think she's considering whether to invest in property here. Financially prudent territory, the Bramble Creek corridor," Gertrude said neutrally. "You know more about those water rights than anyone," he said. "I might ask you to sit down with her sometime if she has more questions." "Of course," Gertrude said. He nodded and left. She stood at the kitchen window for a very long time. Christmas in the Texas Panhandle was austere and brief, the celebration compressed by the practicalities of livestock that needed tending regardless of the date. Gertrude cooked a substantial dinner and set the table in the main house, and the hands who had nowhere else to go came in from the bunkhouse. And there was something about the warmth and the food and the laughter of men who had been through a year of shared work together that opened something in her chest she hadn't expected. Calvin sat at the head of the table, and she sat at the other end because that was the arrangement of the household, and she watched him across the length of the table, the lamplight catching the lines of his face, and she thought about the year that had passed and what she had learned about who this man was. She had learned that he kept his word absolutely, without variation, in small things and large ones. She had learned that he was fair to a degree that sometimes cost him, that he had paid above-market wages to 3 of his hands because he believed they were worth more than the market said, and he had done this without telling anyone, and she had only discovered it in the accounts. She had learned that, when the drought had been at its worst, he had quietly arranged for feed to be delivered to 2 neighboring small ranchers who couldn't afford to buy it themselves, and had put it through the accounts in a way that made it look like a normal supply expense, and she had only realized what it was when she'd cross-referenced the delivery notes. She had learned that he never explained himself at length, but that his actions, examined carefully, were their own kind of eloquence. She had also learned that she was in serious trouble. January 1884 arrived with a cold front that dropped temperatures below freezing for 2 solid weeks and kept everyone close to the ranch, and the work doubled. She had no time for introspection, which was a mercy. She had firewood to manage and food to produce in quantities for men working in cold that burned through calories at a terrifying rate, and she had accounts to reconcile, and the spring supply orders to begin planning. It was in the second week of January that Danny Hoyle came to the kitchen with a look on his face that she associated with bad news being carried by someone who didn't know how to carry it. "There's a man in town," Danny said. "Arrived yesterday. He's been asking about you, Miss Archer." She kept her expression exactly neutral, asking what, who you are, where you came from, who you work for. Danny paused. "Miss Archer, I don't know this man, but some of the things he was asking, Pete heard him too. They didn't sound like someone trying to reconnect with a friend." She set down her coffee cup very carefully. "What did he look like?" Danny described him. "Average height, dark coat, 1 bad eye, a way of holding himself that suggested he was accustomed to being owed something." She knew him before the description was finished. His name was Martin Cleaver, and he was the lawyer's clerk from St. Louis. The one who had borrowed money she'd worked for 3 years to save, $140 that was at the time the entirety of what stood between her and complete destitution, and who had disappeared from St. Louis in the spring of 1880 with both the money and her sense of safety. She had not been naive about him in the romantic sense. She had never felt anything for him that approached romantic, but she had been naive in the more painful sense of believing that professional association meant basic human decency, which turned out to be a more dangerous error. She had not thought about Martin Cleaver in over a year. She had deliberately relocated across 500 miles partly to be unfindable by him, not because she had illusions about recovering the money, but because the idea of him appearing in her life again felt like a particular category of trap she was not interested in negotiating. The question now was why he was here. The answer was not immediately clear, but the possibilities were not encouraging. She told Calvin that evening. She told him all of it. Not because she had planned to, not because she had decided vulnerability was strategically advisable, but because she had been in the kitchen alone with it for 6 hours and had found that the thought of carrying it alone had become, for the first time she could remember, less appealing than telling someone. He listened without interrupting. He didn't ask why she hadn't mentioned her history with Cleaver before coming to the ranch, which would have been the first question a man with hidden motives would have asked. He didn't say anything reassuring or soothing, which she would have found patronizing. It was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then he said, "Do you know what he wants?" "I know what he took before," she said. "The rest is unknown." "Amos's nephew is a deputy in town," Calvin said. I can have a conversation with him. I don't want a scene, she said quickly. If there's no legal basis, I know, he said. I'm not suggesting a scene. I'm suggesting that the deputy knowing a stranger is asking questions about one of my employees is a reasonable piece of information to share. It doesn't require a confrontation, she breathed once. All right. He didn't tell her not to worry. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He said, "You'll want to know what I find out and I'll tell you." And then he went to speak with the deputy's uncle. What he found out was that Martin Cleaver had been following a trail. He had apparently been under the impression, based on a letter that she had sent to Mrs. Calloway in Abilene the previous year giving her address for forwarding mail purposes, that she had come to Texas with money. She had not. She had come with wages and very little else. But Cleaver was apparently still operating under a financial delusion that she had resources he could access. What happened next was Calvin's idea, and she didn't like it at first, and then she understood it. He went to Colton Creek and had a public conversation with the deputy in front of witnesses in the general store, during the course of which he mentioned casually and clearly that Miss Gertrude Archer was the manager of Hunter's Cross Ranch accounts, that the accounts of Hunter's Cross Ranch were the accounts of Hunter's Cross Ranch and not of Miss Archer personally, and that any attempt to involve Miss Archer in any financial discussions of a personal nature would constitute an unwelcome intrusion that would be dealt with by the Colton Creek Sheriff's Office accordingly. He did not make it into a story. He did not make it into a dramatic public defense that would embarrass her or make her position at the ranch seem precarious. He simply made certain facts publicly known, clearly and without decoration, in a way that removed the leverage Cleaver was looking for. Cleaver left Colton Creek by the end of the week. Gertrude heard about how Calvin had handled it from the general store owner's wife, who mentioned it with the particular approving tone of the frontier community when one of its members has done something quietly decent. She came home to the ranch and she stood in the kitchen and she felt something in her chest that she had been trying very hard not to feel for approximately 8 months, and she understood that the wall was not going to hold. She went to find Calvin. He was in the barn, examining the hoof of one of the horses, and he looked up when she came in and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, and went back to the hoof. "You keep doing things," she said, and was surprised to hear her voice come out with less control than she'd intended. "You keep doing things that you don't tell me about them before and you don't talk about them after and you don't present them to me as something I owe you for, and I can't." She stopped. He set the horse's hoof down and straightened and looked at her properly. He waited. "I've been waiting for the trap," she said. "I've been waiting for the moment when all of it becomes something I'm expected to repay. All the good things, all the fair things. I've been waiting because every time someone has done a good thing in my direction, it has turned out to be a precursor to something else. And she stopped again, breathed. "I've been waiting a long time, Calvin." He was very quiet. He looked at her with that steady attention of his that was not an assessment and was not a performance. "I'm not going to do that," he said. "How do I know that?" she said, and it came out raw, which was not something she planned. He didn't answer immediately. He stood there in the dim amber light of the barn and he was thinking. She could see him thinking, and what he finally said was this: "I don't think there is anything I can say that would make you know it." And he was right. That was the thing. He was exactly right. And the fact that he knew it, that he understood that words were not the currency that would solve this, that understanding itself was a kind of answer. She went back to the house. She lay awake that night. The stars over the Texas Panhandle were a different category of stars from anywhere she'd been before, thick and clear and cold as the air itself. And she looked at them through the window, and she had a long, private, thoroughly argued conversation with herself about what she was going to do. The honest version of the argument was this: she was in love with Calvin Hunter and had been for some months, and her system was not as effective as she had believed. And the question was not whether she could continue not being in love with him, because that ship had apparently departed without her, but whether she was going to keep turning away something real because of the very legitimate and historically justified fear that it would hurt her. February brought a particular kind of cold and a particular kind of busy, and she kept her head down and worked, and she was excellent at working, and she found that working did not, as it had always previously done, fully close the space where she was aware of Calvin. Things happened, as things do. Pete Delgado broke 2 ribs in a bad fall from a horse and spent 2 weeks in the bunkhouse, while Gertrude brought him food, and she and Calvin managed the redistribution of his work across the other hands. And there were several evenings where they sat at the kitchen table with the maps and the schedules and worked through the logistics, and she was aware of his presence at the other side of the table with a specificity that made it difficult to concentrate on the maps. He seemed aware of her too, in a way that was not forward but that she could detect with the same precision with which she detected everything. The slight pause before he spoke when she looked up unexpectedly. The fact that when she came into a room he would, not always but sometimes in the small way of someone who hasn't consciously decided to, turn slightly toward her. She noticed these things and did not know what to do with them. March arrived, and with it the first real warmth, and the preparations for the spring cattle work began, and there was more to do than there were hours, and she was grateful for it. She was also, she admitted to herself in a rare moment of direct confrontation with her own interior, tired of managing the distance, tired of turning away, tired of the particular loneliness that she had chosen as the alternative to the particular danger of trusting, when the evidence of 8 months of daily life was that Calvin Hunter was the safest person she had ever been near. She was working on a letter to the Amarillo supplier about the spring order in mid-March when Danny came to the kitchen door with a telegram. The telegram was from a lawyer in St. Louis, and it informed her that Mrs. Calloway, the woman who had run the Abilene boarding house and who had been, in the particular way of strict and unsentimental women of the frontier, one of the closest things Gertrude had to a maternal figure in her adult life, had died in February. She had died without family, the telegram said, and had left to Gertrude Archer in her will the small sum of $100 and a specific bequest of her sewing materials, which were considerable. Gertrude sat with the telegram for a long time. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, or who had the space to cry in the middle of a working day. But she sat very still and she thought about Mrs. Calloway, who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to be, and who had never once said anything soft to her, and who had nonetheless, through the simple acts of providing a roof and expecting good work, and treating her with the contractual respect of an employer, given her something that she had badly needed. She went through the rest of the day mechanically, which was unlike her, and in the evening Calvin found her sitting on the porch with the telegram still in her hand. He sat down in the other chair, the one that was his in the evenings, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He looked out at the range and was quiet. She told him about Mrs. Calloway. She told him more than she'd planned to. She told him about Abilene and about the years before Abilene and about the particular shape of a life built without support, not with bitterness but with the clarity of someone describing a geological formation. Here is this stratum, and this one, and here is where the pressure was greatest. He listened the whole time. He did not fill the pauses with reassurance. When she was finished there was a long silence and he said, "She sounds like she was someone who respected you." "She did," Gertrude said. I think that was the kindest thing she could have done, was just to respect me." He looked at her then and she looked back at him, and there was something in the silence between them that was not a new silence. It was the same silence they had always had, but in this moment she could hear what it had always been saying. April came, exactly 1 year after she had arrived. She had not forgotten it. She didn't think he had either, though he had said nothing about it, because he was not the kind of man who made speeches out of anniversaries. The day itself was a Tuesday and it was full of work, and she moved through it with the practiced efficiency that had become, over the year, something almost comfortable in its rhythm. In the late afternoon, she went down to Bramble Creek, which ran along the northern edge of the property through a stand of cottonwoods that were just coming into their spring green, and she sat on the bank for a while in the way that she had never, in the first months at the ranch, allowed herself to do. Just to sit. Just to be present in the particular slant of the Texas afternoon without purpose. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were quiet, but she was very attuned to them by now, which was a kind of information in itself. He came and stood at the edge of the cottonwoods, and she looked up, and he had a folded paper in his hand. "Mail came," he said. It was not his normal reason for finding her here. They both knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She took the paper and unfolded it and looked at it for a long moment. It was not a letter. It was a document drawn up by the lawyer in Colton Creek, transferring the title of the north quarter of Hunter's Cross Ranch 40 acres, water rights attached to the Bramble Creek tributary to Gertrude Archer. She went back through the morning she had discovered it in the kitchen and said the things she had said, and he had said the things he had said, and then she had told him to stop saying kind things to her, and he had said, "All right," and said nothing else. He had said nothing else. He was standing now at the edge of the cottonwoods, and he was looking at her, and he still wasn't saying anything else. She stood up from the bank of Bramble Creek and faced him, and she had the document in her hands, and she looked at him for a long time, and she understood finally with the full weight of comprehension that this was the language he spoke. Not the language of reassurance, not the language of performance, not the language of flattery or obligation or manipulation. The language of action carried out quietly and without expectation of response. The language of respect expressed as fact. The language of a year of showing up consistently and decently and without agenda until it was impossible to misread it as anything other than what it was. She had turned away every kind word. She had been right to turn them away, for all the reasons that her history had made unavoidably clear. But he had not finally reached her with a kind word. He had reached her with something that words could not approximate or adequately contain, and it had gotten through every wall and every system and every carefully maintained distance, and she was standing in the light of an April afternoon in Texas 1 year after her arrival with the deed to 40 acres in her hands and the full knowledge of exactly what she was feeling. "Calvin," she said. He was still watching her, waiting in the way he always waited. "I'm afraid," she said. "I want you to understand that." "I'm not pretending not to be afraid." "I know," he said quietly. "And I've been turning away." She stopped, looked at the document, looked back at him. "I've been turning away things that didn't deserve to be turned away. From you. I understand that now." He crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took the document gently from her hands and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. And then he looked at her up close, and up close he was just a man who had spent a year being exactly who he was, and she could see all of it in his face, the patience and the waiting and the thing that ran underneath both that was not patience at all. "You don't have to be anything other than you are," he said. "That has never been the asking." She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, against the weathered, honest warmth of it, and he closed his eyes briefly in the way of someone receiving something they had not been entirely certain was coming. And she thought that this small private moment of a man who had been waiting quietly and who received without drama or performance the thing he had been waiting for, was the most intimate thing she had ever witnessed. She kissed him. It was her initiative, which was appropriate, because she was Gertrude Archer and things that mattered had to be claimed deliberately and not fallen into accidentally. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, whole and steady, and absolutely without reservation. The cottonwoods moved in the April wind. Bramble Creek moved over its rocks with its particular quiet voice. 40 acres of Texas grassland lay to the north, titled to her name, and the sky over the panhandle was the wide and unboundaried blue that you could only see in country with room enough to hold it, and Gertrude Archer stood in the middle of all of it and felt, for the first time in the better part of a decade, something she had been afraid to name. Safe. They walked back to the ranch in the long golden light, and she was aware of his hand near hers, and then his hand finding hers, and she let it, which was its own kind of revolution. That evening after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch and she asked him, because she needed to ask him, "Were you ever going to say anything, if I'd kept turning away?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated more than a quick answer would have been. "I was going to give it until October," he said, "the year's mark, and then I was going to accept the answer of your actions whether or not I'd gotten any other kind." "That's a very long time to wait," she said. "You were worth the waiting," he said simply. "You still are." She leaned into his shoulder, which was something she had never imagined she would do with any person, lean into them in the easy, quiet way of people who have established trust over time and are no longer performing the absence of it. He put his arm around her and they sat and looked at the Texas night with its vast permanent stars. "The North Quarter," she said after a while. "The 40 acres. That was the deed you were writing when I came in. Yes, you'd already decided to give it to me. You'd already earned it." She thought about this. "That was before I—" "Yes," he said. She sat with the meaning of that for a long time, in the way she sat with things that deserved the time. He had drawn up the deed before he had any reason to believe she would receive it as anything other than what he'd told her it was, an accounting of her work. He had not done it as a move. He had not done it to get something. He had done it because in his assessment she had earned it, and the rest was its own matter entirely. That was the man. That was the whole of the man in one quiet act. "Calvin," she said. "I love you," she said, and it came out clearly, without trembling, without the defensive coating she had put on everything of value for years. She said it the way you say a true thing when you've finally decided that truth matters more than safety. He was very still for a moment, and then he pulled her closer, and his voice when he spoke had something in it she had not heard there before, a fullness, a warmth she had only ever seen in the periphery of his expressions. "I love you, Gertrude," he said. "I have for a long time." "I know," she said. "I was watching." He laughed, a real laugh, the one she'd heard only a few times, and she felt it against her side where she was leaning into him. And she thought that a life that had this in it would be a life worth the trouble of having built. May of 1884 brought the spring work in full, and with it, the particular complexity of two people who are discovering each other at the same time as they are managing the practical demands of a working cattle ranch together, which turns out to be, simultaneously, the most inconvenient arrangement and the most revealing one. You learn a great deal about someone in the practical trenches of shared work and shared decision-making, and what Gertrude learned was that the man she had observed for a year was the same man close up, which was rarer than it sounded and more valuable than she could easily articulate. He asked her to marry him in May. He did it in the morning before the day had properly started, standing in the kitchen while she was working on the accounts and he was pouring coffee, and he said, "I'd like to marry you, Gertrude, if you're agreeable," and there was something so perfectly, characteristically undramatic about it that she had to put down her pen and look at him for a moment to make sure she'd heard correctly. "That's a proposal," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're not going to kneel down," she said. "I can if that's what you'd prefer." "No," she said, "I prefer this." She stood up and went to him. "Yes," she said, "I'm agreeable." They were married in June in the Methodist Church in Colton Creek by Reverend Hart, who was a practical and succinct man who conducted the ceremony with efficiency and warmth. Amos Tilford was Calvin's witness. Gertrude had written to the general store owner's wife, Marta Prescott, who had become the nearest thing she had to a friend in Colton Creek, and Marta stood beside her as her witness, which Marta did with the wholehearted approval of a woman who had quietly been hoping for this outcome since November. Danny Hoyle spent 3 days beforehand in a state of barely contained celebration that manifested as an unusual quantity of unsolicited woodchopping in the vicinity of the kitchen. Pete Delgado, whose ribs had healed completely by now, presented Gertrude with a small carved wooden box that he had made in his own time as a wedding gift, and she received it with genuine thanks that seemed to surprise him, which she thought said something unfortunate about what people expected of her that she was determined to correct going forward. The wedding was small and real. The dress was one she made herself from fabric she ordered from Amarillo blue-gray wool for late June, because it was the Texas Panhandle, and the celebration would be brief before she was back in the kitchen managing the dinner, and she made it with the precision she brought to everything, and it fit perfectly. Calvin wore his best jacket and his hat, and he looked exactly like himself, and when she came down the aisle of the church, he looked at her with an expression that she recognized, because she had been watching his expressions for a year, and she knew that this one was the unguarded version, the one without any professional or social layer over it. She thought she might have been the only person in that church who could read it for exactly what it was, because she had spent a year learning the language, and what it said was everything. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the ranch for the Hands and a few families from town, and there was music from a fiddle that Amos had been playing for 40 years and brought out for significant occasions, and there was dancing on the porch boards in the summer evening, and Gertrude Archer, who was now Gertrude Hunter, danced with her husband in the light of the hanging lanterns, and the Texas sky above the Panhandle went the particular sequence of colors it went at summer dusk. Orange to rose to deep violet, to the first faint emergence of those enormous reliable stars. She pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, and he held her, and she breathed him in, and she thought about all the turned-away kindnesses and all the walls and all the years, and she thought that the best thing about arriving somewhere safe was that you could look back at the road you'd taken and understand it in a way that was not bitterness but simply accuracy. Every turned-away kindness had been the right response to an insincere kindness. She had been right about all of those. What she had been wrong about was the assumption that the pattern was inevitable, that all kindness hid a trap, that safety was possible only in solitude. She had been wrong because she had not yet met someone who was kind in a way that did not require words to contain it. She had not yet met Calvin. Now she had, and she had 40 acres and water rights and a marriage and a man who was, she had come to understand, as essentially himself as the Texas sky was essentially itself, enormous and clear and reliable and occasionally terrifying in its vastness, and she was made, it turned out, exactly right for this landscape and this man and this life. July and August of that year brought the heat in its full Panhandle intensity, and the work was constant and unrelenting, and Gertrude managed the household and the accounts and the domestic operations of Hunter's Cross with the same capability she had always had, but she found now that there was a dimension to the work that had not previously been there. When she solved a problem, there was someone to tell. When she was tired, there was someone who noticed. Not in the performed attentiveness of people trying to be noticed being attentive, but in the quiet, accurate noticing of someone who simply knew her well enough to see when the tiredness was the ordinary kind, and when it was the kind that ran deeper. In September, she told him, she was carrying their child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning when the light came in golden and low through the east window, and she had known for 3 weeks and had said nothing during those 3 weeks because she was still, at some deep level, practicing caution in the ways that old habits insist on. But she told him now, directly and without preamble, and she watched his face. What happened on his face in the moment she told him was something she kept private afterward, stored in the particular treasury of things that were hers. The fullness, the realness of it, the way a man who had spent his entire life building things with patient intention received the news that something new was being built. He crossed to her and put his arms around her very carefully, as though she were something he could not afford to drop, which she found touching in its absurdity given that she had spent the previous week hauling flour sacks. "How are you?" he said against her hair. "Reasonably well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise capable." "I know you're capable," he said, in the tone of someone who was saying something else entirely. She smiled into his shoulder. "I know you know," she said. The pregnancy was, on balance, a manageable experience. She reduced her heavier physical work in the second half without being asked and without drama, reorganizing her tasks with the same efficiency with which she reorganized everything. The hands treated her with a careful courtesy that she found somewhat amusing and gently discouraged. And Marta Prescott came out from town twice a month through the fall with practical advice and genuine warmth. And Calvin watched her with the particular attention she now knew to read as love. And the months moved forward. Their son was born in the early spring of 1885, on a clear March morning, delivered by Doc Harlan from Colton Creek, who was competent and unhurried. And he was a large and vigorous infant who announced his arrival with considerable determination, and they named him James Amos Hunter. The middle name was for Amos Tilford, who had been at the ranch when there was almost nothing and who had built it with Calvin, and who received the news with a particular quality of silence that was, for a man of his experience, fairly close to tears. Calvin held James for the first time in the chair beside the bed, and Gertrude lay against her pillows and watched him hold their son with the same complete attention he brought to everything that mattered. And she thought about a woman who had arrived at a train platform in Abilene 2 years earlier with a trunk and 2 bags, and the most effective emotional defenses she'd been able to construct over 9 years of necessity. She thought about what that woman had been carrying and what it had cost her and how right she had been in the specific instances and how wrong she had been in the general principle. And she thought that the greatest risks she'd ever taken were the ones where she had finally, after everything, decided to let someone in. And the greatest of those, the deepest and the most consequential, had required her to do nothing except stop running, stop turning away. Calvin looked up from their son and found her watching him, and he held her gaze with the quiet intensity that was so entirely him. And she thought that there was no language adequate to this moment, which was fine, because they had never needed to rely on language. James Amos Hunter grew into a strong and curious child, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's capacity for deliberate silence, and he was followed, in the spring of 1887, by a daughter they named Elena Ruth, who had Calvin's patience for about 45 minutes before demonstrating very clearly that she had her mother's directness in full, which made Gertrude love her with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The ranch grew through those years. Calvin expanded the herd and the range, acquiring additional land as it became available with the same patient strategic intelligence that had built everything else. Gertrude managed the accounts and the household with a capability that, by the late 1880s, was recognized across Colton Creek and into Amarillo as the kind of operational excellence that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. The Hanson land dispute was finally resolved in 1886 when Everett Hanson, old and tired and without heirs, sold his property to Calvin at a fair price, and the Bramble Creek water rights were consolidated and clear, and Gertrude's 40 acres were absorbed into the larger holding she co-owned with her husband, though she maintained the title separately because she had earned it separately, and that distinction continued to matter. There were hard years, as there always were on the frontier. The terrible drought of 1886 baked the panhandle for months and required everything Calvin had in terms of planning and contingency, and Gertrude managed the household economics with a precision that allowed them to weather what destroyed 3 neighboring ranches. They got through it. They got through the cattle market collapse of 1887 together, over many evenings at the kitchen table with the accounts and the maps, working through the numbers until a path forward was visible. And the path was narrow and required sacrifice, but it was there, and they took it. Danny Hoyle, who had grown from an uncertain 19-year-old into a capable and trusted hand, left the ranch in 1888 to take his own property in New Mexico, and Gertrude and Calvin sent him off with a proper meal, and a cash bonus that represented the respect of consistent work. Pete Delgado stayed and brought his brother's family from Mexico to settle in the territory, and the ranch's community deepened and diversified in ways that Gertrude thought were good for everyone involved. Amos Tilford retired in the summer of 1889, at 66 years old, to a small house in Colton Creek that Calvin helped him buy, and Gertrude brought him meals twice a week, and they played cards on Thursday evenings, and he told her things about the early days of the ranch, about the man Calvin had been at 21 when there was nothing and he'd chosen to build something. And she listened to these stories with the pleasure of someone filling in the portrait she'd been assembling for 6 years. The portrait by now was complete in its essentials, she thought, though she continued to discover small additional details with the regularity of someone living closely alongside a person of genuine depth, which was its own ongoing gift. Their third child arrived in the fall of 1890, a second son they named Thomas William. He came into the world at harvest time when the ranch was at its busiest, and the timing was, as Gertrude observed with serene practicality, impractical, to which Calvin responded by managing the harvest logistics entirely so that she could rest, which he did with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and which she received with the same grace she had spent 7 years learning. Colton Creek grew through those years, as the Texas Panhandle grew, with more settlers, more families, more of the slow, complex accretion of community that happened when people decided to stay. Gertrude became, somewhat to her own amusement, a person people came to for advice about accounts and domestic management, the practical kind of advice that required honesty rather than reassurance, and she gave it honestly and directly, and the people who came to her kept coming back. She helped Marta Prescott reorganize the general store's books when the Prescott's operation grew beyond what its original accounting could hold. She helped 2 newly arrived families understand the water rights documentation that the county surveyor's office produced in a language that was technically English but practically impenetrable. She helped a Mexican family, newly settled north of Colton Creek, navigate the bureaucratic requirements for land registration that the county clerk administered with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on who was asking, and she navigated it with a firmness that did not permit varying degrees. Calvin watched all of this, and she watched him watching it, and they had, over the years, developed a communication that required very little spoken language, because they understood each other so thoroughly that the essentials were exchanged in the quiet between words. One evening in the early fall of 1891, she was sitting at the kitchen table doing the ranch accounts by lamplight, a thing she had done 1,000 times, and Calvin came in from the porch and stood in the kitchen doorway, and she looked up. He was just looking at her, not saying anything, just looking at her with the same quality of attention he'd been giving her since a train platform in Abilene when she'd stepped off a train and he'd picked up her trunk without making a speech about it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She held his gaze for a moment. 8 years, she said. He thought about it. 8 years and a few months, he said. She set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, and she looked at him standing in the doorway with the lamplight and the Texas night behind him, and she thought about the woman she had been and the distance she had traveled, not in miles, though the miles were considerable, but in the distance between armored and open, between defended and present, between turning away and allowing in. "I'm glad I stayed," she said, "when I had reasons to leave." "You had a great many reasons," he agreed, and she heard in his voice the acknowledgement of what he knew about those reasons, about the specific shape of the darkness she'd brought with her. "Best reason to stay," she said, "was that you never once asked me to be someone I wasn't." He came to the table and sat down across from her, and he took her hand, which was inked slightly with the ink of the accounts and warm from the lamp, and he held it in both of his. "You didn't need to be anyone other than who you were," he said. "I knew that the first time you told me no and meant it." "That was about a trunk," she said. "Yes," he said, "but that kind of no is a kind of information." She laughed, and the laugh was full and unguarded, the kind that had come easier every year of this life, and he smiled at her across the table with the quiet warmth that was his particular expression, and that she had been reading accurately for years now and never tired of. James was 6 and Alina was 4 and Thomas was almost 1, and the house that had been built for function was gradually, over years of being lived in, acquiring the particular density of a home that has known children and seasons and the specific warmth of people who chose each other. There were drawings on the back of old account ledgers from James's early artistic phase. There was a dent in the kitchen doorframe from a farming implement Alina had been investigating at the age of 2 with more enthusiasm than judgment. There were photographs on the mantel in the parlor that had been taken by the photographer who came to Colton Creek twice a year, stiff and formal as all such photographs were, but with something in the eyes of the 2 adults that the photographer had no doubt seen many times without necessarily naming it. What it was simply this: 2 people who had found the specific other person who fit the specific shape of who they were, and who had, against the evidence of their histories and the caution their histories warranted, decided to trust that. In the winter of 1891, when the accounts were done and the children were asleep, and the ranch was quiet under a first frost, Calvin built the fire in the parlor and Gertrude sat beside it with her mending, and he sat across from her with his book, and they were together in the easy silence of people who don't need to fill the quiet because the quiet itself is a form of companionship. After a while he looked up from his book and found her looking at him, and she didn't look away, which was its own kind of testament to how far she had come. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that I've been paying attention for 8 years," she said, "and I still find things I haven't seen before." His expression did the thing it did when he was moved and was not broadcasting it, which she had long ago learned to read. "Such as," he said. "You put more wood on James's side of the fire," she said. "You do it every night, because he runs cold and you noticed." Calvin looked at the fire for a moment, then back at her. The expression was full now, quiet and full. "He does run cold," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed you noticing," she smiled. "That's new information." He put his book down and reached across the small space between their chairs and touched her face, a gesture of such plainness and such tenderness that she felt it behind her breastbone in the way that the most ordinary and truest things always hit hardest. "Gertrude," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." She turned her face into his hand and held it there, and the fire crackled, and the panhandle night was enormous and cold, and starred outside the windows of the house that had become a home, and in the morning there would be accounts and children and the honest labor of a life built piece by careful piece, and all of it was exactly right. She had turned away every kind word for years. She had turned them away because they had always been currency for something, because softness had always been a door to obligation, because she had been right, in all the specific instances, not to trust what felt designed to make her grateful and therefore compliant. She had been right about all of that. And she had been wrong about the whole, because the words were not the kindness. The words had never been the kindness. The kindness was in the action consistent and quiet across years, in the trunk carried without ceremony, in the water rights defended without being asked, in the deed drawn up because it was accurate, in the hands who were told the truth about a woman's integrity by a man who owed her nothing except the truth, in the patience at the cottonwood bank where the creek ran over stones in its ancient particular voice, in the year of waiting and the silent knowing that what couldn't be said could still be entirely true. Calvin Hunter had said it all without words. And Gertrude Archer, who had spent a decade defending herself against the lies that came wrapped in language, had finally, standing by a creek in the April light of a Texas afternoon, heard it. She had heard it, and she had put her hand against the face of the man who had been speaking it every day in every act that required nothing back, and she had let herself be loved by someone who had never needed the declaration to know what it was. The fire burned low in the parlor of Hunter's Cross Ranch in the winter of 1891, and outside the stars were the enormous stars of the Texas Panhandle that she had first seen through a bedroom window more than 8 years ago and had never stopped finding remarkable. And her husband's hand was warm against her face, and the children were asleep in the rooms above them, and the accounts were done, and the cattle were in the winter pasture, and all the walls were down, had been down for years now. And the ground where they had stood was planted over with something that had no fortress in it, only roots and growth and the particular quiet certainty of a life that was, at last, entirely her own. She had arrived with a trunk and 2 bags and all her defenses intact. She was still here. She always would be.